I just want to join with previous speakers in, first of all, stating my unhappiness with the lack of response and an inability by the accounting officer to answer basic questions in respect of the cost of the liquidation of IBRC. I think it's something that we need to come back to in more general terms, because there's a pattern here where commercial sensitivity, legal advice and also outsourcing of some work is creating a barrier between us as a Public Accounts Committee and witnesses and accounting officers. And while they are not legally compelled to come here and answer questions, they are certainly obliged, I would say, and there would be an expectation that they would answer questions and basic questions. So in the last couple of months alone, we've had Nursing Home Ireland, the HSE, Education Training Boards, and Garda Síochána, the Department of Education, HICWA, the Department of Communication, the Department of Transport and the Department of Finance in terms of PPPs, all offering up commercial sensitivity, legal advice or different covers or cloaks to avoid answering what I would see as basic questions. And I think that we need to come back to it. I think Dr. Makshari is right, because how do we do our work? And that's not for Mr. Carville. It's something that I think by way of observation and by way of a recommendation that we do come back to it as part of a discussion on our work programme later. Can I ask first of all, Mr. Carville, just on that subject, what is the nature of the court case that is being taken?
So the plaintiff, and if I get any of this wrong, I'll come back in writing because I'm not a lawyer, but my legal advisors tell me the plaintiff is looking for declaratory relief, and that's why an endorsement of claim has been filed. Okay.
And why would that then preclude you from answering questions around costs?
Because the accusation in some of the claims, and if you're familiar, there's 10 different points mentioned, are quite accusatory in nature. So we have to defend that before the High Court.
So what you're going to defend is what you see as something which is not factually correct. So I would imagine if you offer up a defence, you are going to defend your department, and the liquidators will defend themselves against claims that they feel don't stack up or are not factual. Would that be a fair assessment?
A fair assessment, I believe, in terms of the department. The liquidators are not yet party to this, but they could be.
From the department's perspective.
From the department's perspective.
But you would accept that facts are facts. So, for example, how much your department has spent up to date on the liquidators is a fact. So if that is a fact, why can that information not be given to us? Well, it's not going to alter, it's not going to change, it's a matter of fact.
And perhaps it's a nuance, but actually the department hasn't spent anything on the liquidation. It's the bank that spends the money on liquidation. Yeah, so the money comes out of it. It's not directly exchequer funding, it's not voted expenditure.
But you can't give us the amounts, you can't give us the figures.
Well, I mean, the figures are in the 4 documents we've already published, which detail, in a lot of detail, I would argue, the cost of liquidation to date.
Give me the figure then.
Just bear with me a second, yeah. So I'm looking at page 39 of the Progress Update report dated 5th of May 2017. This is on our website with the other 3 reports. Let me just refamiliarise myself with this for a second. So it's a 35-month period to December 15 is the first column, but actually the 47-month period. So this is the cost of the liquidation to date. So if I go right down to the bottom of that page, and in fact, sorry, if you don't have that, would it be easier if I shared a copy with the
overall figure
so
of how much to date has been spent?
But it's up to the 31st of December 16, yeah. So it's 226,586,000 euro.
Okay. And can you tell me then...
Sorry, 222 million. I think I say 222 million euro.
Can you give me the figures then in terms of the breakdown per hour for example, partner, director, associate director, manager, supervisor, senior accountant? Are those figures publicly available?
No, that's not publicly available, but the rates per hour are. So, sorry, are you looking for the number of hours or the rate per hour?
What is available and what is not available?
Right. Okay, the rate per hour is available, and we've answered this in parliamentary questions previously. So, the rate for a partner is €295 per hour. For a director is €260 per hour. For an associate director is €220 per hour. Manager €190 per hour. Senior accountant €165 per hour. A semi-senior accountant, 165 is the same as a senior accountant. Trainee accountants is not applicable, and junior accountants €95 per hour. I mean, what we can do, which I think would be helpful, I think, is there are what we call court-approved rates, and this is one of the things we did want to get into today. So in all those categories, or certainly the first, second, third, fourth, fifth category down, the court-approved rates are higher, and in some cases substantially higher than those rates I've just called out.
But this is a lot of information that is now in the public domain, and you've put on the record of the Public Accounts Committee. And it goes back to a statement that the Cathaoirleach said earlier. The other questions then that were then asked that you were not in a position to answer. Why are you not in a position to answer those questions?
Because I'm quite happy to talk about information which is in the public domain, because that's information I will be using, and the plaintiff knows I'll be using that. But I'm just not going to show my hand in terms of how I'm going to defend litigation, and this applies to any litigation. I have been before, on behalf of the department, on litigation before the High Court, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, the European Court of Justice, and this is no different in many respects.
Mr. Carvin, the legal advice that you got.
Sorry, if I can just finish out. So we have plenty of litigation against the state through the department or through the Minister for Finance. The approach we're adopting here is entirely consistent with the approach we would adopt in any of those cases. So once we can successfully defend our position, that's our objective. I'm quite happy to talk about this again, but as I mentioned to the two deputies earlier, Murphy and Connolly, we will revisit this as we go through the process. So I'm not saying we're going to wait until the very, very end of this process. If we can get refreshed legal advice that tells me I can talk about this in greater detail, we will act on that and let the Chair know straight away, let the Secretariat know straight away.
And I think, by way again as an observation, and you have committed to again going back to seek further legal advice, can I say that part of the problem here, Cathaoirleach, is that almost like in general terms, what we get is a synopsis of the legal advice, which is we cannot deal with these issues. But the parameters of what can and cannot be discussed are never set out for us. And we would then have a view around, well, there might be some logic in not answering this set of questions, but there is no logic in answering another set of questions. But what we get is a general blanket or wall put between us, which is we can't answer any of the questions, and we obviously are not privy to the legal advice that you got. And I think there's a serious problem for the Public Accounts Committee in that. So you said you would come back to the committee once you've got legal advice, but I think that there is a clear lack of accountability here. And I think that goes back in the department for a long period of time. I know one of the Department of Justice was under scrutiny for a culture of secrecy. If there's a culture of a lack of transparency in any department, that would worry me. And I think in today's instance of what I've seen so far, I think there is still in the Department of Finance, and I'm not happy with it, and I'm just putting that on the record. And you have defended your department, and you have said that's not the case, and that's why I'm accepting what you said, but I'm giving you only my opinion. It isn't the opinion of the committee, it's my personal opinion, so I'm just putting that on the record. And I do want to come back to that broader issue later. If you want to comment, you can. Yeah,
if I could, Deputy. Look, I accept your opinion, but I would point out that these documents we've produced, between 2018, so it'll be based on the end of year 2017. So it'll be. We normally produce these in April, May every year. This is a voluntary document. There is no legal requirement for us to publish this document. We published 4 of them. This was the department's idea in consultation with Minister Noonan at the time in 2014, and we felt this was a really good idea to provide transparency. There's a huge amount of detail in these documents. The latest one actually is probably lighter than the other ones because there's less work going on now, but when we were going through the various loan sale processes. There's a huge wealth of information in these documents, and I respect what you're saying, but let me just say these are voluntary documents. We didn't have to produce these. We had no obligation whatsoever to produce them, and we did.
I think what's the problem for us is that many of us have spent a substantial amount of our time dealing with what is a distraction that we should not have to deal with, because the body of the chapters are quite substantial, and we haven't had, in my view, a fair opportunity even to probe them, because we've spent so much time going over and back in respect of that issue. So I think that's problematic. I'm going to park that now because I've made my point, and the Secretary, or sorry, the Assistant, is Assistant Secretary General, or is it Mr. Carville? What's your own?
So I'm actually not an Assistant Secretary General. My rank is equivalent to an assistant. So I'm seconded in from the NTA. Okay. So I'm equivalent to an Assistant Secretary.
If I can just turn to the substantive issue, if I can. The gross cost of capitalising the banks, according to the Comptroller and Auditor General's Office, is 66.8 billion. The net cost of the state is 39.9 billion, and there's an average cost of between 1 and 1.4 billion a year to service the associated debt, which are the headline figures that are essentially in the CNHG's report. And all of this is a consequence of the fact that the state essentially recapitalised banks, and as a consequence of that nationalised some of these banks as well. Isn't that correct?
Nationalised some of the banks, or effectively nationalised two of them, nationalised one bank, and had a minority shareholding in another bank.
And why were the banks not nationalised before the crash?
Well, there would not have been any requirement to nationalise the banks before the crash.
Well, there was never any legal requirement. I'm saying, why were they? What was the rationale for not nationalising any of these banks when they were they profitable banks before the crash?
Yeah, the banks. So we had 14 banks operating in the country before the crash. Retail mortgage banks, I'm thinking of. Some were owned by foreign subsidiaries. Some left the market for various reasons. Some closed down. Some were sold. Two were merged, obviously, into IBRC, as you know. The ones which were predominantly Irish were the three banks quoted on the stock exchange at the time. So Irish Life and Permanent, as it was called then, which is now PTSB. Fair
to say that the vast majority of banks that were operating in this state, and certainly the Irish owned banks, were profitable banks before the crash. And what I'm asking is, why did the department not at that point consider nationalising any of those banks? What was the rationale for that? Why would you not have considered it?
Well, so if I just understand the question, so if we go back and just try and make it real, so like in, for example, 2002, why did the government not have a policy of, well, you know, it's a policy question, it's not a matter for the department.
So it was a policy decision to then, so say post the crash, there was a decision then to nationalise them, which came on the back of the bank guarantee, and as a consequence of having to recapitalise the banks, by investing so much in the banks, the quid pro quo is that the state would become a shareholder and essentially then would de facto own the banks. So that was a consequence of that policy decision that was taken. Is that what you're saying?
A policy choice was made over several years, and the cumulative effect of which was that the state ended up as, at one point in time, a 99% shareholder in PTS, or Irish Life and Permanent, 99 AIB, and 14.
So we took a decision to nationalise the banks when the banks were broke, essentially. When the banks were insolvent.
Some of the banks were nationalised, but the Irish banks, if I use that expression, it's an expression I'm slightly uncomfortable with, because actually they're owned by shareholders, many of whom are outside the state. But if I just use the kind of the non-technical expression, Irish banks, yeah, a policy choice was made to invest in the banks.
Nationalised, but were broken banks.
Sorry, I don't want to disagree with you, but it's invest in the banks, and the consequence of which was that some were nationalised, or effectively nationalised.
Most were. And then in terms of those institutions, were they public or private institutions? When they were nationalised, they were private organisations?
They were private organisations quoted on the stock markets.
And how many other private organisations at that time were subject to what you're calling here stabilisation measures? So how many private companies that went to the wall, or maybe did not go to the wall because they were bailed out by the state, how many private companies did the state bail out other than the banks?
Oh, that's outside my area of expertise. Sorry,
well, you would, if it was public money, because obviously you would know about the banks because it's within your remit. The state would have had to bail them out. So how many other than the banks, are you aware of any other private institutions that were bailed out by the state that got taxpayers' money?
I am not aware. I'm just looking at my colleagues if anyone else is aware. I mean, when I think of the 64 billion, I'm not familiar with another number which is of a reasonable magnitude that would strike something in line.
Yeah, because those companies went to the wall because that's what happens. They either went to the wall, they weren't bailed out by the state. People lost their jobs. People who invested in their companies lost. But a different attitude was taken to the banks, and it goes back to something you said earlier. When asked the logic of this, you said, well, I shudder to think what would have happened had we not bailed out the banks. Of the 66.8 billion of the gross cost of capitalising the banks, how much of that was Anglo debt?
Or
what would now be the IBRC's book?
29 billion was Anglo. So INBS, Irish Nationwide Building Society, was about 5. So 34, 35 between the two.
Half of it. And
correct. Over half, yeah. Was
that a systemic bank? Was that one? That bank was it a high street bank? Would it have had? Could you put it on par with, for example, the Bank of Ireland or Allied Irish Bank? I'm not sure if anybody in this room was a customer of Anglo Irish Bank. I certainly wasn't. It was seen pretty much as a developers' bank and
yeah, so we're going
an investor's bank, if you like, more so than a high street bank for ordinary customers, wasn't it?
So you're going way back in time before my involvement in banks within the department, but I would accept the premise of your question, which is, did it have a branch network around the country? No, clearly it didn't.
Okay, so when you said earlier on then that I would shudder to think what would happen if we had not taken that decision, might hold some logic for a fraction of the 66.8 million that was spent, but for the majority it would have made no difference, because if Anglo had been left to go to the wall and the state did not take up the liabilities, I fail to see how that would have been problematic for the state. And just to come back to that figure of 1.7 billion, I think last year was the cost of servicing the debt. Is that right, Mr. Hines? That was the figure you gave earlier.
1.7 billion is the estimated cost for servicing the debt this year.
This year, and that's pretty much just paying the interest. That the capital is paid, or the principal amount is only paid down when the state, for example, if we sell off the AIB shares or whatever, we pay down the loan, but the amount stays the same that we owe, and the interest is an annual interest fee that's paid for by the state. Isn't that correct?
If we just develop that slightly, because there's actually three buckets. So there's various ways we can recoup the 29 billion that went into what I called living banks earlier. So we'll either receive interest income. When we had debt-like instruments, so COCOs and preference shares, we received interest on those instruments. In the case of AIB, you might have seen earlier on this year, they declared the first dividend for 8 or 9 or 10 years. So we received 99% of that. So we received dividend income as well. When we sell the investments, so we've sold preference shares in Bank of Ireland, contingent capital, convertible contingent capital notes or COCOs in Bank of Ireland. We've redeemed preference shares in AIB, so that's income capital.
Well, of that 1.7 billion, and we can now surmise, given that a majority of the money was for Anglo-Irish Bank, so of that 1.7 billion that we now pay back on an annual basis, maybe it's higher or lower, but it's within that range. In my
I think it's actually an exact figure from the CNAG.
It was 1.7 for last year, was it not?
But yes. I think of that it might be a billion. I think is related to
a billion. Okay, do you know how many homes that would build? Have you done the math on that? How many homes 1.7 billion would provide?
Yeah, we would have an estimate of that. So
it's 5,000 on the figure that the government should choose. Yeah. 5,000 homes built on an annual basis would sort out the housing crisis. 5,000 homes could be built every year, and yet we're spending this money on debt, which was put into private institutions, which we had no legal obligation to bail out. Certainly before the bank guarantee. So 5,000 homes, we're talking about a housing crisis that could be sorted and not be a problem if we did not have this debt hanging over us.
But again, as I said, there was a policy decision made at the time, so I can't express a view on that, good, bad or indifferent.
Yeah, well, I'm expressing a view, and I'm not expecting you. As a citizen, you might have your own view. I'm giving you my view as a citizen. Mr. Dorgan, can you tell me the difference between a promissory note and sovereign debt and bonds? What's the difference?
Well, I suppose I'm not a legal expert, but I think a promissory note is essentially characterised. Deputy Connolly said it's a promise to pay in time. Sovereign bond is very similar in a sense, but it is a sovereign debt instrument which has been given out. So, you know, it's essentially the state will repay you in due course.
And when we had the promissory notes, that was essentially a promise that the state would burn the money periodically, wasn't it? The central bank would literally burn money or take it out of circulation. They would take whatever the figure was at a given time out of circulation.
The sovereign said that they will meet the obligation, what has been
but technically
committed.
how that was done was taking the money out of circulation. It's not correct, Mr.
Well, the money would have to be paid to the, you know, the promissory note was it was used as a capital instrument, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially, and that amount of cash would have gone in, as you saw, I think in 2011, there was a payment to honour that promissory note, the first year.
The money for, and my understanding of it is, and you might then forward this committee with a more detailed note on this because it is important. Yeah. My understanding of the promissory note was that the central bank was given permission to print whatever the figure was, 30 billion euro. Was that?
You see, if you look at the finance accounts in 2011, you will see the actual cash payment from the central fund to honour that promissory note.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, but the promissory note was used as an asset, but that the central bank was able to lend money, to provide liquidity to the bank. So maybe that's where you're coming from. Okay. That they were creating liquidity by virtue of the fact that the bank had this as an asset.
You might drop us a note on that, but there's certainly a big difference between promissory note and sovereign debt. That's for sure.
Well, no, just to make absolutely clear, the promissory note, there is a payment from the central fund in 2011 to honour it. There was a slightly different arrangement used in 2012 in terms of an issuance of a sovereign bond, effectively to honour the promissory note payment. But there is a cash payment from the central fund in 2011.
I just have questions, Cahill, in respect.
You said they created that fund to pay to Anglo as it was then, as a result of the promissory note being issued. The central bank was able to.
What I'm saying is the central bank provided liquidity to the bank,
right,
using that as collateral.
Exactly.
And that liquidity was emergency liquidity assistance.
And was that terminated ultimately on the payment to
my recollection is that it was, yeah.
Yeah, it was a temporary increase in euros.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And had to be taken back out of, sir.
Yeah. So give us the note and when it came back, when it is temporary.
So that's the point I was making. So
yeah.
Can I just then turn to the NAMA side of it? Because am I right in reading or my understanding of the Controller's report? Maybe Mr. Harkness, you can help me with this. That the gross cost of capitalising the banks was 66.8 billion. Is that separate from the 31.8 billion that was then given to the banks to basically take the bad loans off that was separate?
That's correct. That was the 31.8 billion that NAMA issued in bonds was described as a contingent liability on the exchequer.
So it's a separate payment again, and
it's very important. As Andrew says, like it was a contingent liability on the state. Yeah. So from NAMA's perspective, it was very important that contingent liability was extinguished, and it has now been extinguished in full.
I understand.
So,
yeah. I'm just making the point that it's separate from the overall figure.
Yeah.
And of that 31.8 billion, then. Do we have a breakdown of where that money went in terms of what banks got what? Is that in your report?
I don't believe so.
Can you give me those figures? Can you give me the breakdown, please?
You can provide that because it's all.
Can you give it to me now because I need to know from my questioning?
I don't think I can. I don't have it at the top of my head. We can get it though. We can get it for you.
There's a problem where I don't have the information I need. So sorry, Carl. What I'm looking for is NAMA paid 31.8 billion to banks to purchase property-related loans. What I'm looking for is a breakdown of that 31.8 million went to which banks, how much went to which banks, which is a reasonable question to ask in the context of this report. Unfortunately, the information is not at hand, but I need that for my follow-on question. And my follow-on question is, am I right in saying that, again, Anglo would have got a fair portion of that 31.8 billion?
You absolutely are, but we don't have the exact numbers, sorry. We're getting it.
Yeah. And can you tell me as well what would have been the range of the value of the properties? So the top end ones, so say the top 10 properties that would have been, or loans that would have been taken over, would you have that breakdown? So of the 31.8 billion, you're talking here about the state essentially took the loans, the bad loans, and paid the 31.8 billion, but the borrowers owed just over 74.4 billion. So the information I'm looking for was the volume of loans in the first instance, and then the range of what they were, and then the top 10 in value terms.
So what we can provide, what I don't have in front of me today, but we can get for you very quickly, is the haircuts per bank, the value of loans transferred by bank. The third question you asked around the top 10, I mean, that's not information which we would have access to. We don't have that information.
But would you have that? You see, what I'm trying to do here is to tease out where exactly that money was spent. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier, Cathaoirleach. Look, as members of the Public Accounts Committee, we are working off a report from the Controller and Auditor General that gives headline figures. So our job then is to probe those headline figures and to do a deep dive in terms of where that money went. And there is a headline figure of 31.8 billion that went into banks, paid from NAMA into banks to essentially take bad loans off the banks' books. And I'm looking for a breakdown in the first instance of how much went to what banks, and the information isn't at hand. And then I'm looking for a range of what the value of those loans are. That isn't at hand. So why wasn't that work done in advance of coming before the Public Accounts Committee today? Surely you would have understood. Sorry, Mr. Carville, I haven't finished my observation or my point. Surely you would have understood that our job today is to probe those figures. So we just don't accept headline figures that we're given. That's fine, that's the headline figure, and we don't have any questions to ask in respect of it. Our job is to ask questions on those headline figures. And I would expect some level of breakdown, some level of detail to underpin those figures, and I'm not hearing it.
Yeah, we have that information, and we'll get you as much as we can today. Colleague is.
But my time will be up.
But sorry, the CNAG produced another report that dealt exclusively with the acquisition of loan assets and went into that in quite a level of detail. We weren't here to talk about that report. We're here to talk about the chapter on stabilisation measures, and it doesn't go into any detail in terms of that. We'll get you as much information as we have to hand, and then we'll follow up with any information.
That detail is in the CNAG's in that chapter.
In terms of how much was issued.
38. And you're missing my point entirely, Mr. Hines. What I'm saying is that the headline figures are in the report. Our job is to probe beyond the headline figures, and to simply say, well, we'll come back to you at some point. So when I get that information, and this is what I said to previous accounting officers in the past, you're going to provide me with that information. You're gone, and I'm gone. So we're not here to discuss them. We're not here to account for how the money was spent.
Sure, but it's a very detailed, very specific question. It would just be so much better if there's any way of asking that question beforehand, so we could come in with the information. It would make our lives a lot easier, and would make your life a lot easier as well, if there's any mechanism for that. But the best we can do is we'll get the information. It is publicly available information, and we'll send it on. And
was that information in the special CNAG report?
I think it's in the previous section 226 report.
Is there any way it can be called up? It's in, we'll stay going, but I think the CNAG covered that in your previous special report on NAMA. If it's possible for someone to, I'm sure it's in it. Okay.